So our input component is ready. Now we need to put a button inside this input component. How can we do this? Well, there is a special trick here. What you see here is not an input component. It's giving you the illusion of an input component. In reality, we have a div or a container. Inside this div, we have two elements, an input field or an input component and a button. The input component here doesn't have any borders. The actual border is applied to the div, to the container. So to implement this layout, you're going to wrap this element inside a div with the class of input-group. Let's move it right here. And then next to that, we're going to add a button with two classes, btn and btn accent. And the label is search. Now let's implement the input group class. So with this class, we can group an input field or an input component with something else. In this example, we are grouping it with a button, but we can also group it with an icon or any other elements. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new rule, input group. Now, this input group should have a border. So we set the border to 1 pixel, solid, CCC. This is the same color we used for our input component. So now it's a good opportunity to refactor this code and define this color somewhere global. So we don't have to repeat it in multiple places. So on the top, we go to our color palette and define a new color for borders, CCC. Now, let's find all occurrences of this color. So here's one instance. We're going to replace this with color border. Good. And one more time. All right. Back to our input group. So here we're going to use color border. Great. Now we should give this a border radius of 30 pixels. Again, we are using the same value that we used earlier over here. So we can refactor this and move it to somewhere global. So on the top, we define a new variable called border radius, and we set it to 30 pixels. Now, back to our input class, we're going to replace this with border radius. Great. And one more time for our input group, border radius. Good. Let's see what we get up to this point. We get this weird layout, but don't worry, we're going to fix this in a second. First, we need to remove the border from this input component. This is where we need to use nesting. So when we are in an input group, if we have an input, that input shouldn't have a border. So we set the border to 0. Good. All right, the border is gone. The next problem is the placement of the button. The input group has stretched to take up all the available space because it's a div, it's a block level element, and that's how all block level elements behave. So to push the button to the right, we want to make this input field or this input component grow and take up all the available space. How can we do this? Well, we can use flex here. So back to our input group, here we're going to set the display to flex. Now, this input component is a flex item, right? So here we can set flex grow to 1, and this will make this input field grow to take up all the available space. Now take a look. Great. Now my browser is a little bit larger than my recording window, so this is actually what we should get. Great. The next problem we need to fix is the margin around the button. So let's inspect this element. As you can see, there is a 10 pixel margin above and below our button. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule for buttons inside input groups. So input group and btn. These buttons should have a margin of 4 pixels. I'm using an absolute value here because I don't want the margin to be dependent on the font size or the viewport size. I always want to have 4 pixels of margin. Now take a look. Okay, I think that looks much better. Now let's type something here, like a really long string. Okay, everything looks great. Now let me show you something really cool. Back to our markup. Inside this group, we have an input and a button, right? Now I can move the button and put it before the input field. And here's what we get. We can also replace the button with something else, like an icon. So let's pull up icons.html and grab our basic icon template. So copy this and drop it here. Good. Now take a look. We have an input field with an icon on the left side. We can also put an icon on the right side. All these combinations work. So this is the benefit of building these individual components in isolation. When we build and test all these components in isolation, then we can easily combine them to build complex pages. This is what we call the bottom-up approach. In contrast, with the top-down approach, we start at the page level and start building different elements. With this approach, we end up with weird layout issues, and sometimes troubleshooting these issues can be time-consuming. Now, one more thing before we finish this lesson. If we type something here, look, there's so much space between the text and the icon or the other element, whatever it is. So let's see where this space is coming from. I'm going to inspect this element. All right, look at our input field. This input field has 35 pixels left padding. So if an input field is inside an input group, I want to reduce the horizontal padding. So here we have a rule for input fields inside a group. Here I'm going to reduce the padding to 1.5 rems for vertical and 1 rem for horizontal padding. And here's what we get. I think that's much nicer. So we're done with our input components. Now it's time to store this template in our components folder. Then review our code and commit it to the repository. I will see you in the next lesson.